everyone. Thank- Hi, everyone, and welcome to VMA Group's Meet the Author in Conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's fantastic to see such a strong interest from the communications community. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Crystal Pierce, and I'm a recruitment consultant at VMA Group. I started Meet the Author in 2022 as a way of giving back to the communications community by creating a space where you can hear from thought leaders within communications. Today's session is one I'm excited about as we're joined by Lisa Riemers and Matisse Hamel-Nelis, authors of Accessible Communications. Accessibility in communications is no longer a nice to have. It's fundamental to how we engage audiences, share ideas, and ensure that information is genuinely available to everyone. Lisa and Matisse are experts in this area, and they're going to share practical insight into what accessible communications really looks like in practice and how we can apply it within our own organizations, classrooms, and communities. There will be a chance at the end of the session for a Q&A, so please do have a think, and remember, no question is a silly question. On behalf of VMA Group, thank you for joining us today, and I'm now going to hand over to Lisa and Matisse.
Thank you, Crystal. What a lovely intro. Let me get the slides opened up. Can you see the slides as we'd hope they would?
Yes, we can.
We're good.
Fantastic.
Seeing some thumbs up.
Great. So my name's Lisa Riemers. Hello, everyone. There's some lovely familiar faces in here and people that I've not met before. I'm based in London. I'm an accessible communications and content person. I've been working independently for the last 7 or 8 years now, and met Matisse Hamel-Nelis a couple of years ago at the IABC World Conference in New York, and we hit it off immediately. And a couple of years ago, she approached me. It is a couple of years ago now. Approached me and said, "Would you like to write a book on accessibility?" And I said, "I'm not sure. Do I? Shall we?" And it's been quite the journey getting here today. Matisse.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matisse Hamel-Nelis. I'm an accessible communications consultant and part-time professor based out of Oshawa, Ontario, which is just outside of Toronto. I have been in the accessibility space or accessible communication space for just over 10 years, starting out at the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, otherwise known as CNIB. My career and journey into accessible communications started off with a tweet where a hashtag for "Did you know?" DYK was used on my second day, and I was told it doesn't read the way I thought it read. And we can get more into that later on, or we can have that story time at the end of the presentation when we talk a little bit more. But it's been an absolute pleasure writing this book with Lisa, and I'm so honored to be here today and to share some insights with you. So, what are we going to cover? First, obviously, our brief introduction and a reminder about what is accessibility and disability overall. But then we're going to get into the good stuff, what we're really here for. So, how to make sure your content is written in plain language so that it lands with your audience and resonates with them. Writing better descriptions for your images and graphics. So, writing them in a way that everyone can understand what you're showing, and creating better social media assets. So, we want to ensure that we're emphasizing your key messages rather than getting lost in the clouds.
So, something that comes up for us quite a lot, and you might have this in your organisation, it might be something that you're already championing, or it might be something that you're curious about. But I often get asked the question of who is impacted by accessibility. Isn't it an edge case? Isn't it something that's only none of my users are blind? I've spoken to lots of people who think this doesn't apply to them. But I've got some statistics that show it's actually it's more important than you might think. So 1 in 3 of us, so thinking about the number of people that have joined us on this call today, 1 in 3 of us will need assistive technology at some point in our life. We're all only ever temporarily not disabled. Maybe you're short-sighted and you left your reading glasses at home, or you're out and about and your device, you're running out of battery. Sometimes we're disabled by our surroundings as well. But when we think about reading glasses, that's a simple type of assistive technology. It's not just about thinking about if something works, if it's being read out loud by the kind of screen reader that someone might need to read content out loud to them. Making things accessible means it's making things easier for everyone to understand your information. And as we and our population ages, it's also thinking about designing the information that works for our future selves too. So 1 in 6 people worldwide identify as disabled. And when we say that, what we mean is a physical or mental impairment that has this is the UK Equality Act definition, where a person is considered to have a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that has substantial and long-term negative effects on their ability to do normal daily things. And so if we're talking about this as 1 in 6 people worldwide, a little bit closer to home, very close to home, and weirdly equal for in the UK and in Canada, the number's 1 in 4. So 1 in 4 people in the UK and in Canada identify as being disabled. And that's a quarter of us. That's a lot of people who might have additional needs, or might have needs to be able to access your information. 1 in 10 people are dyslexic. So making things easier to read helps that estimated 10% of people who may struggle to read large blocks of text. And block capitals can be harder for people to read because it's harder to differentiate between letters. Writing your key messages in block caps makes it harder for people to scan and read quickly. Also, something that I found fascinating when we were doing research for the book, I didn't realise it was firstly as high a number as this, and secondly that there was as big a difference. But 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women are colourblind. And that's on top of people, when we're thinking about colour and use of colour in our social media assets or on our web design, colour contrast failures are the most common issue that found in accessibility audits. And we're all getting to use brilliant tools like Canva now to design things that we like. But it can be easy for our key messages to get lost amongst a sea of low contrast information. Something that I see quite often, and I've been guilty of myself in the past, is designing a social media graphic that's white text on a light blue sky background, or a lovely black and white photo, and then having white text against a light grey background. That makes it harder for people to see your key message. And if your key message is just that, you want to make sure it stands out and isn't just sort of melting into the background as a bit of a vibe. I also put this slide together because I feel like it, all of us have been stressed at some point in our lives. We're never reading information in perfect conditions. And this is a visual of what it's like in my head a lot of the time. And also, as my husband points out, none of the cogs are actually connecting with each other either, because there's lots of things on the go at once. But if we're stressed or tired, it creates a cognitive impairment, which makes it even harder for us to focus than the average. And that's also before we consider the estimated 1 in 5 folks who are neurodiverse. So when we're thinking about who we're designing for, and thinking about We want to try and make it as easy as possible for people to connect with our message. We're all busy and we don't have time to be spending, like, I don't know, I found myself doing this recently, is if something's too hard to engage with as I'm scrolling in my feed because I need to squint or zoom in, I'll just scoot straight past it.
And it's with that in mind that we always say and we believe that we don't want to just stand out, we want to be outstanding. We talk about communications as a professional communications in particular as a way to really engage and get a message across to our audience, broad or narrow. However, when we think about AI and how it has helped us in generating image descriptions or write our words in a way that is more easy to read and that is able to resonate with our audience, we also need to understand its limitations as well. And hopefully we get lots of questions about that in the Q&A section of this. But when we focus on don't just stand out, be outstanding, we want to talk about and focus on the fact that if we are being true professional communicators, we need to think about communication excellence. And without communication excellence, you don't, if you want to have communications excellence, sorry, you want to have accessibility woven into your day-to-day practices, not just a once-off, not just an afterthought, but really thought in from its ideation to the creation through to the execution and promotion. So, how do we do this? We think about the principles of accessibility. So these principles of accessibility are considered part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG or WCAG or WCAG. Everyone has their own variation of saying it. I say WCAG. And WCAG has 13 guidelines. These guidelines are broken down into the 4 main principles, which are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. You might be thinking, what does this even mean? Well, one thing to consider, it's easy to remember when you think of the acronym POUR. So POUR starts with P for perceivable, which means that the users can see, hear, or sense it. It cannot be invisible or impossible to access. It has to be perceivable in some way, shape, or form. The O in POUR would stand for operable. Can your user work the thing they're trying to access? U in POUR would be understandable. Does it make sense to them? Can they understand it? What you're trying to say? And the R in POUR is robust. It shouldn't fall over if someone tries to access it in a different way or than what you'd expect. In this particular instance as well, under the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or WCAG, it's also future-proofing your content to ensure that anybody can use your content no matter what their device is and if it's an older or newer platform or operating system. These principles of accessibility were created by the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as W3C, and they are broken into 3 levels. From level A, which is the least strict, to level AAA, which is the most strict. But it is recommended that we meet, and not only recommended, but it's usually stated in legislations across the world, that you meet the level AA standard. And we'll show you how that works in practice momentarily. But when we're talking about legislation, like I mentioned, we talk about the level AA standards. But who has accessibility legislation around the world? First, Canada, where I'm based, we have the Accessible Canada Act that came into assent on June 21st, 2019. And it was actually an act that I helped promote and get signed as part of an activist group, which was really, really cool to see. Side note, in the EU, we have the European Accessibility Act, which is Directive 2019/882. In the UK, there is the Equality Act of 2010 and the Public Sector Bodies Website and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations of 2018. And the United States, they have the Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990, otherwise known as the ADA. And in a lot of cases, when you hear about accessibility lawsuits, you're probably hearing them come from the United States, but they help set precedent on what is considered public space, including the web, and what accessibility truly looks like when it comes to web accessibility. So, what should accessible content look like? Well, first of all, it needs to be written in plain language. Plain language is not simply oversimplifying your content. It is writing in a language that your audience understands the first time they read it. A lot of people speak English as a second language. People who are autistic may read things literally, so including idioms, metaphors, and colloquial phrases. And like Lisa mentioned earlier, about 10% of the population are dyslexic. So writing in plain language really helps get your message across the first time, not the 15th time with 3 questions asked to other people to say, did I get this right? The next, using white space. So when you're working on any device without relying on specialist software, think about things like white space, simple language, short sentences that help remove barriers to groups when it comes to how things are written and how they are shown. Right. So this provides an experience where they can get the access to information right away. And next, we have not exclude anyone that are unable to perceive it. Right. So a great example of this is if you think about things like graphs and flowcharts, right? It can be very difficult to understand when you're just relying on color, when you're just relying on particular patterns of lines, for example, in a line graph. But we need to understand that we need to provide text options or text variations to this information as well. So people who can't see it or maybe don't see it or perceive it the way we think they would are able to still be included in the conversation and understand what's going on. People who use screen readers rely on alt text to describe images. So in things like a complex flowchart, for example, that can't be explained with alt text, or you don't explain it with alt text or an image description, you are telling them they are not welcome to your information. But at the end of the day, with the legislation, with what accessibility is and the accessibility principles, compliance should just be the baseline, not the goal. This is more than just a checkbox exercise. This is changing the culture and what we do and how we do it. So when we think about accessibility, it shouldn't be the afterthought, or it shouldn't just be, did we do that checkbox? Great, we're done. But rather, are we thinking about it in everyday practice of what we do so that it's, again, not an afterthought, but rather top of mind at all times?
So, thanks, Matisse. Just going into a little bit more detail on what Matisse has started talking about there. Plain language is something that is in most of our control. We are able to, one of the key things when we're thinking about accessible social media content or writing emails or writing web content or even print, is making sure that we use the language that your audience understands the first time they read it or hear it. And it's presented in a way that is formatted clearly and it's readable. I had an interesting experience a couple of years ago in one of the many times that I've been temporarily disabled, where I went to hospital to get an X-ray, and I was told by the staff on the reception, go to the X-ray department. And I was struggling to find where the X-ray department was on this list of departments, because it was not written there, because X-ray is a subsection of imaging, but it is somewhere that lots of people get directed to all the time. There are times when precise terminology is important, and there are times when thinking about what your users actually need is more important. And when you're using this kind of, when you think about all of the times when you, it's when you, if you've gone into an office building and it's those hastily taped up signs that are really meeting user needs, whether it's because somebody on one reception desk keeps getting asked about something that's in a completely different department, or whether it's because someone's used the technically correct definition rather than the word that people use. Using the right words is something that's vital, and it's something that we need to test with our users. Something else that we touched upon thinking about plain language is that kind of ambiguity and misinterpreting things. A lot of the time, when we're talking to people, we're working with people in all different locales and jurisdictions and countries and cultures, and sometimes words don't travel don't travel in the way you expect. And I've got one particular example where I was working with a tech team years ago based in Cincinnati, and it was fascinating seeing the different ways we communicated. But there were certain phrases that we would use in the UK as Brits, which caused a bit of an upset. So in an email, we said, well, that's a bit of a shame. And while she might have seen those memes that circulate about what Brits say and what Brits mean, in this case, what us Brits meant was it was a bit disappointing, but not a major deal that we weren't able to get something done in the time that we thought. But what happened was this got escalated to the directors because they thought that we were saying for shame on you. They thought we were parading the IT team through the streets, yelling shame at them. And that wasn't what our intention was at all. And using clear, unambiguous language is really important to help things not escalate in the first place. But if you have messed up, it's also equally important to acknowledge that and commit to being better in the future.
So, how many of you have heard of the F pattern or F patterns? This is something that we need to be cognizant of when we are creating our content. Many people read printed material different than how they read things online. Online, we look at the F pattern. So on the screen, you will see a website on tigers in crisis and a heat map that shows how people are actually reading that website. There are also a bunch of different patterns. When it comes to the F pattern, take a step back. It's how we scan. We scan this content very quickly. Is it important in the first little chunk? Can I get the information I need right away? And then sort of, if it's of relevance to me, I will continue down. If not, for example, in this particular image, you'll notice it was very heavily read in the F pattern at the very top. And then in the subsection, we sort of said, yeah, okay, we're good, and we're out. So there are also a bunch of other patterns that have emerged in recent years, but ultimately, when it comes to how people scan or scroll and them just simply being busy, it's the F pattern. So we need to ensure that we're getting our key information out to people as quickly as possible. And this advice originally came from NN Group back in 2006, but it still holds up today. Think about how you absorb content when you're online, whether it's on your phone, on your computer, on a tablet. You're probably using the F pattern without even realizing it. So how do we make this easier? Well, let's think about the anatomy of a page. On the screen, you will see two examples. One is what I like to call tombstoning, which is very text heavy. It's just text, 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 text. There's no breaks or anything like that. And we have a yellow X across it. The reason being is that we want to avoid this style. We want to actually break up our content in an easier, more bite-sized way so people can really engage with the content. So you'll notice on that same image to the right of it, you have little paragraphs, bullets, headings, so on and so forth with a nice yellow check mark. So how do we get to that great anatomy of a web page? So again, using headings, subheadings, and paragraphs helps give your page structure. We don't need massive paragraphs. We just need short paragraphs that help us scan a bit easier. And also bullet points are a huge, huge help when you're trying to get main points across. Because again, we are busy, we are rushing through a lot of our content, whether we like to admit it or not. So if we're able to scan and see, oh, these are the important highlights with bullet points, we're getting that information. When we consider these parts of the anatomy of a page, we're helping users scan down the content. And having left-aligned content is always easier to read versus center justified. What about links in our content? Now, this is somewhere where something that a lot of people have been guilty of, myself included. There is no shame here. This is a progress over perfection type of field. It's a journey. We are all part of this journey together. But when it comes to links, we want to ensure that your links have information bearing words. So we're looking to avoid things like click here or more. It doesn't provide context as to where things are going or where the end user will be taken. So, for example, if you have an annual report, you wouldn't just simply say click here. You might say download our annual report, and download and the annual report is all hyperlinked. So again, it tells the end user what's going to happen when they click on the actual link itself.
So here's another example, an anonymized example based on an email that I received a while ago. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of text here. The paragraphs are quite meaty. You can't actually, depending on how good your screen is, you might not be able to read everything here. You'll notice perhaps that there are 3 heres that are click here that are here, but you need to be able to read the whole paragraph before that word here to know what here means. And underneath the sign off, it says, underneath Kate's sign off, it says in-person event register here, online events register here. But again, you need to go back and read the words that came before here to know what that sentence means. And in this example, I'd been sent this by email and I replied back to the sender saying, I'd love to come to this. How do I register? And they sent me a really short email back saying, but the email, the links were all in the email, Lisa. And when I looked at where the links were, I hadn't even noticed the in-person event bit because that was after somebody's email signature. And I assumed it was part of their general, we've got a new thing coming out, you know, the kind of wallpaper that you get in the background. And as you can see, the pictures also didn't download. So I just didn't literally register that these were registration links. So thinking about how I'd rewrite that or maybe make it a bit easier to read based on the guidance that Matisse has just been talking about. The thing with emails is having a good subject line is a really good starter. If you're just saying update from the CEO or Monday update, it doesn't necessarily entice people into what's in the content. And also, if you've got a bunch of them in your inbox, or if they're being stored somewhere online, you want to be able to differentiate between them. But having meaningful headings helps people understand what's in that content. So I broke that wall of text into headings. I've used the bullet points to talk about what the benefits of that thing are. You'll see in the hyperlinks, the actionable words are in there. Order the thing, join us in person, join us online. These are all ways to help people. It helps with your call to action, and it helps people actually know what that action needs to be. And hopefully it means you won't get someone emailing you, say, asking the questions that were all answered in the email that you sent previously.
So, how do we make our graphics and graphs work better? The biggest thing is checking our color and descriptions. So with tools like Canva, it can be tempting now more than ever to really just run with as many ideas as possible and be as maximalist as you want to be. However, it can get very busy, and we don't want our graphics to look like anyone else's, which is a key priority because, again, we want to stand out. However, we don't want to clutter our messaging. We want to ensure that it's still easy to understand and easy to resonate with the audience that we're trying to get across to. And another thing to consider is that low contrast colors means that your message just simply gets lost in the background itself. So what do we mean by that? So we have an example from VMA Group, who have very graciously allowed us to use this example. At the top is a light blue graphic with meet the author in conversation with in all capitals, and then my name, Matisse Hamel-Nelis, and Lisa Riemers underneath in a cursive text. The issue here is the color contrast. So we worked with a VMA group to provide understanding on how to improve the accessibility of this graphic itself. So one, the color contrast, the white text on that light blue background doesn't pass the WCAG guidelines for AA compliance, which states that for color background to be compliant, you need a 4.5 to 1 ratio. And we're going to look at some examples of that momentarily. Additionally, the white design, the swoosh design that's going on across our names makes it more difficult to understand because, again, it's that white on the light white on the white as well, and then the light blue. So it gets lost in translation and in conversation. When we're looking at this type of information, we want to ensure that color contrast, we're meeting that 4.5 to 1 ratio, that the background graphic itself doesn't interfere with the key message. So in this case, it was interfering with our names. I promise we're not conceited. We just wanted the information to get across. Thirdly, the handwriting font isn't perfect, right? Cursive fonts aren't accessible to those with low vision or learning disabilities. Again, it's similar to that whole having all caps. Our brains look at words based on the shape versus the actual letters to read words initially. So when everything is in all caps, we are seeing everything at the same space and size versus the peaks and valleys of writing in sentence case. So that also changed in the after graphic where you see below that has the darker blue color, a less cursive font, and the meet the author in conversation with is written in sentence case. Again, the reason that we asked for these changes was we are talking about accessibility and we wanted to ensure that what VMA group we're doing was also accessible, right? So as we mentioned before with the capital letters, 1 in 10 people are dyslexic, as well as it just taking longer for anybody and everybody to scan and understand what's happening when it's in all caps. So going to the color contrast aspect, there is a website called whocanuse.com. Which is a fantastic website that allows you to see what the color contrast is for your colors. So your background color and your foreground color, your foreground being your text, right? So here in the initial one, we have a ratio of 2.9 to 1, which is a fail according to WCAG. But also this website shows you what different people, what people with different types of color blindness actually see. So you can see that when it comes to the different types of color blindness, this fails across WCAG as well. We're seeing fail, 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 fail because of that 2.9 to 1 color contrast ratio. And whocanuse.com is free for anybody who wants to use it. It's a great website. Strongly recommend if you want to see how it looks. So then we fixed it. We said, let's make it darker. Let's have the white be a whiter color, like a stronger white. So here we now see that our color contrast ratio in the newer improved version is 7.63 to 1, which is now not only AA, we are surpassing that. We are at a AAA compliance. And not only that, when you look at the different types of color blindness, we're now also at a AAA across the board. And an interesting thing to note is that what the different types of color blindness are seeing are very similar to one another. It might be a slight touch of a shade here and there, but the colors are being consistent across the board. So we are providing the most accessible version and the most accessible and inclusive access to the information as anybody, depending on whether they have color blindness or not. It's all the same to everybody. Now, when it comes to writing alt text, we have the graphic here that was used on social. PowerPoint suggested alt text, for example, was a blue background with white lines. There's so much more here than this. If I were to describe this, I would simply say on a blue background, white text reads VMA group, meet the author in conversation with Matisse Hamel-Nelis and Lisa Riemers. the date, the time, and that it's online. And I would say there are the headshots of Matisse Hamel-Nelis and Lisa Riemers in the middle. The other information where we have that circular meet the author icon in the bottom right-hand corner, that is just a graphic. We've already said what that information in the actual text, so it's just decorative in my opinion. Same with that swoosh effect behind our images. One thing to consider when it comes to these types of graphics, according to WCAG, anything that is visual in terms of a GIF or a video should be able to be stopped. So if you're using this on social media, on Facebook or Instagram, you can pause something, but if it is just constantly playing, it's not providing that ability. But it is slow enough that it does pass the level A WCAG, but without the stop button, it doesn't meet the AA. And then going back to just a quick thing that you can do in PowerPoint. As Lisa says, we're in the matrix right now. Don't worry, it's okay. We have a screen grab here from PowerPoint. We haven't exited out of our presentation. But what we've done here is that we've put in the same graphics that we showed you before and just simply did the remove color option to see what it would look like in the grayscale. So you'll notice the top image that we had originally, it's a little bit harder to read or to decipher because of that light background with the light font, or the lighter background with the light font, and the swoosh going through it. Versus the final version, which had a darker background and a bit of a bolder font, it pops out more, so you're able to really distinguish what's going on.
So, something that Matisse touched on as well is, so what we were looking at just then was using PowerPoint's inspect without color option, and there's an accessibility checker in PowerPoint too, as there is also in Canva and in many design tools if you're using them. This is a graphic that, although I love the colors on it, wasn't entirely accessible for a previous session that I did. And Canva has a built-in accessibility checker, and there are all of these online checkers. And I guess the first step is to know that they're there and they can help you. The second step is to know that they're also not perfect. There's one thing getting an automated checker, but specifically for this example in Canva, the gradient effect on the title of the session was applied through a kind of add-on filter that Canva's built-in accessibility checker didn't notice. So it expected that you might be able to tell, looking at the screen, the kind of purpley blue DIG in digital is particularly low contrast compared to the colour of the background, so that's harder to read. Please do get familiar with the accessibility checkers, but they are also not perfect, and they're one step in testing stuff with actual humans. So just to summarise a little bit, when we're thinking about accessible content, we want to make sure that we're not relying on just any of these things to help people understand something. If they can't see it, then colour, shape, size won't help. If they don't have the sound on, or if they are deaf, then just relying on sound won't help. And describing things in a visual location in the text, like the table below or the image on the left, very often isn't true because someone's looking at it on their mobile rather than on a laptop. So that's, as a starting point, you're setting yourself up for failure there. But also, that kind of above, below, left and right doesn't necessarily make sense to someone who is using a screen reader. So when you're thinking about describing things, bear that in mind. So thinking about video, what if it doesn't load, it doesn't appear, it can't be played, or it freezes? Or what if someone can't see it at all, or can't access that audio, or they left their headphones at home and don't want to be that guy on the train? Videos and audio files and podcasts need transcripts and captions. You don't want to let your message get lost. Images, which we've already touched on a bit, do need descriptive alt text and captions to explain them. But it matters, depending on the reason for your image, your alt text might be completely different, and where it's being used and why. So is the image likely to be familiar with the people seeing it? I originally presented this slide to an Australian audience who were all able to instantly recognise the landmark. But depending on the context, suitable alt text for this could be Sydney Opera House, if it's being used to illustrate an event set in Sydney, in the Opera House. It could be a view of Sydney Opera House framed by Sydney Harbour Bridge from the Botanical Gardens, if you're particularly proud of that image, or actually if you're trying to describe the image from a more artistic point of view, or if it's on your company intranet, it might just be talking about the weather. You could just say it's an overcast sky in Sydney. So it really depends on what that image is trying to convey. You don't need to describe absolutely everything at all times, but make sure you're picking out the information that's important. And here's a slightly trickier example. It's that Sphere Arena in Las Vegas. And again, so PowerPoint, as lots of other tools do, actually provide a suggested alt text, and PowerPoint suggested a large globe with lights on it. And that's actually not that terrible compared to the actual one that was provided when I found this online. Something to watch out for is that your alt text isn't where you put in who the image should be credited to from a photographer point of view, because a lot of the time alternative text is only read by people using a screen reader, unless you're using something like Blue Sky where everybody can click and see it. But the image feels a bit like an impossible one, and you don't need to be putting the photographer attribute in, and you shouldn't be using alt text for SEO either. You could use a relevant keyword or label as part of the description, but it's there to help people who can't otherwise access the image understand what they're missing. Similar thing with diagrams. This is a useful resource I had shared with me, and I like it, although I've since discovered that it's possibly not 100% accurate and maybe a tad political depending on where you stand. But diagrams need a good explanation too. And I've put in the description here, which says it's a Venn diagram, which shows all of the different aspects that make up the different parts of the British Isles or British Islands or UK.
So as we wrap up, this is just a high level into what is accessible communications and how we can start implementing best practices to be more accessible. But remember, impactful content stands out when accessible content is there, because it is better for everyone. We want to use plain language. We want to create clear structure. So again, going back to those headings, lists, and thinking about our reading order. We want to write effective descriptive alt text that fits the context of how your image is being used. And we want to make our images and graphics accessible as well. Because at the end of the day, you don't know who's going to access your content or how your content might get shared. So by ensuring that you are being as accessible as possible, you're ensuring that the broadest audience will be able to access your information. And again, it's progress over perfection. You will never be, and this is going to be a controversial statement for some, you will never be 100% accessible to everybody. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to the end user experience. And when you think about the end user, some end users might have been using their assistive technology for 10 years, while others are just getting started. Their experiences will be different. They are navigating it a bit differently. So whenever you do get feedback, don't take it as a slight, take it as a learning opportunity and how we can do better and improve our communications. Start the conversation on this. I think that's a great question. I'm seeing it a lot with nonprofit organizations that I'm working with, and it becomes it's It's an accessibility accommodation for these individuals who require the hard copy versus just here's a digital file. So that's how we've sort of been working along with it. It's an accommodation, just as if somebody would say, I need an accessible PDF version of this. There is that high cost component to it, but also working with the individual who is requesting the materials to see what works best for them. In a lot of cases, what we found in the organizations I've been working with is that the individual will even be happy with a USB drive that gets sent to them instead of having the actual physical copy. In other cases, so thinking about CNIB, for example, they have a large Braille library. They are sending out Braille versions, which, of books and of documents and of all that stuff, which is very cost prohibitive when it comes to sending out large documents. But again, it's an accommodation and working with advocacy groups to try to get postage taken care of from that perspective. If it's an accessibility accommodation, there should be funding supporting that. That's obviously a larger conversation and a larger initiative, but we're seeing that more and more happening because it's considered an accessibility requirement. Just because somebody can see, can feel, can read something online, but they prefer it to be a physical hard copy because maybe that's just how they absorb the information better. The screen hurts their eyes, whatever the case is. It is an accommodation and should be seen as such.
So providing that plain language content, also providing it where text isn't embedded into an image or just into a PDF means that people could also locally translate it themselves. It's one of the other challenges. Particularly, I've noticed when I'm booking to go on holiday and following the social media accounts of like visit this place, if all of the content's just in a design PDF, I can't understand it unless they provided an English version. So
Okay.
providing it with plain, like literal plain text, not plain language, but text that's translatable means that people could use that locally. There are lots of automated tools that, whether it's in browser translations on websites, they're not 100% accurate. They're not perfect. If it's intranet content, um, Microsoft and Azure has got a translation option available, which you could turn on. There are lots of intranet products that can also work in that way. But I think it's just making sure that text is translatable to start with and not kind of locked up in things that people can't read. It comes back to knowing who your audience is and who you're writing for, because plain language for one audience might be different. Your audience has their own understanding of context, and I think if you're using technical terms, it's okay to use the precise technical terms, but make sure that they're explained the first time they're presented. And ideally, if you've got an internal glossary as well, you can refer people to spell out acronyms the first time you use them. And it's about understanding who you're writing for. So we're not trying to oversimplify things. We're trying to make sure that the people who need to read it can get it without having to think, well, what do they actually mean by that? That, sometimes oversimplifying things in the interests of reading age actually it kind of hides the meaning a bit more. So yeah, that's
Mhm.
what I'd say there.
Again, she's captured what I would have said. So thanks, Lisa. How do the panel feel about infographics? I love them when they are done right. And what I mean by that is it is not one massive graphic that is flattened and it can't be dissected, but rather you are creating it in a way that is blocked off and can be used either as one full infographic or even as parts for, let's say, social media. That way you can add in alt text for each individual part and the end user isn't overwhelmed with all the information of a large infographic. Again, thinking color contrast, plain language and how it's written, how it's perceived, um, not overfilling it with a lot of, fun little designs that aren't necessary or aren't needed, and they're just sort of cluttering the information. Clear, clean infographics. I absolutely love them, and I think they can be very, very helpful and useful when done right. Is ask your audience as well. Like, yes, we have things like the PDF accessibility checker or PAC 2026 now. As the new one came out, that can check your PDFs. It's an automated checker. You put it in, and technically, as long as it has tags, you'll probably pass. But is it actually structured properly? You need that manual check. Creating your content and saying, "Oh, look, I have my alt text embedded into my image on social media." You're meeting certain people's accessibility needs, but in other cases, like for example, those with low vision or cognitive disabilities, they might miss that information because the alt text isn't actually placed in the caption itself. This is just a way of ensuring that everybody gets access to the information. But you might not know what you don't know. We don't know everything, but please know that. We're learning something new every single day. So it's always engage with your target audience and engage with that community in a way that is authentic and not just asking for like, am I doing this right? Just to check a box, if you will. But rather we want to improve. We want to continue doing better. And there's always new things that are coming up. There was a recent post about how to make bullets accessible on LinkedIn, which was really exciting that I shared with Lisa, because to date, bullets, when people use emojis, they all have their own alt text and it is chaos to a screen reader. But now there's potentially an alternative to how to create your content. So there's new stuff happening all the time. So my biggest thing would be engage with that community that you're trying to work with and to try to make accessible, because again, that progress over perfection, that accessibility for everybody, it's not a one size fits all, it's a one size fits one kind of thing. So in seeing where things are and how to help.
Brilliant. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you both Lisa and Matisse. I really do appreciate it, and I know the comms community does as well. Please do buy yourself a copy of Accessible Communications. I know we've run over, but I have to share this. I've been reading it because of the session, which is what I like to do. And one of the things that resonated with me was about making accessibility a team effort. And it's a little image of three people standing next to each other, pointing at each other. And basically, it's a critical role, and empowering every team member to contribute creates a shared sense of ownership and accountability. So it is really interesting. It does make you look at content differently. So do grab your book. But again, thank you so much for joining, and a recording will follow as well.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you so
us.
much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.